Saygıdeğer misafirler ve değerli katılımcılar. Türk
Distinguished guests, distinguished participants, we would like to welcome you to the International Conference on the Events of 1915, organized by the Republic of Turkey Presidency's Directorate of Communications. I will be your host during the conference. For more than a year, we have been able to come together only through online events. We hope to meet you again face to face in the healthy days to come in the future with you, our distinguished speakers, so that we can make use of your experience and accumulation of knowledge. I think you would also appreciate that. Today's conference is very meaningful. The losses suffered during World War I is our shared pain, and the more we heal the wounds of the past, the better, more prosperous and peaceful future we can pass on to the future generations. So we hope that today's conference will contribute to healing the wounds of the past and act as a hand that extends to the pain suffered 100 years ago. This is an important step taken in that direction by the Directorate of Communications. In today's conference, we have speakers, academicians, NGO representatives, researchers from Turkey and around the world, and we would like to express our gratitude to them in advance. The opening remarks of the conference will be delivered by Professor Fahrettin Altun, Director of Communications of the Turkish Presidency of the Republic of Turkey, and also Professor Birol Çetin, President of the Turkish Historical Society. After the opening session, we will have 3 sessions which will deal with different aspects of the events of 1915. Using the chat box, you can ask your questions, send your questions, and we will answer 3 questions at the end of each session. Without losing any more time, I'd like to leave the floor to Professor Birol Çetin, President of the Turkish Historical Society. Distinguished Director, distinguished participants, distinguished speakers, let me say good morning to each and every one of you and express my respect, first of all. Of course, speaking about the events of 1915 and reviewing the facts in this field is very important, and I'd like to thank the Directorate of Communications for this effort. The reality, the facts, are not valued sufficiently because it is the perceptions that take central role in today's world. Although you are right, you have to shout out and raise your voice to say that you are loud. And I know that we will keep defending, advocating this case in which we are rightful. And I hope that we will be able to tell this case to future generations in a more precise and stronger manner, because we know that we are right. Back in 1940s, 50s, these theses were put forth, but our academia, scientific world, and foreign affairs officials have all provided very meaningful and to-the-fact answers. To the point answers, and we always keep saying that historians should be the ones to discuss these matters, but unfortunately they fled this field and took refuge in terrorism. As you know, many diplomats of Turkey have been martyred, and we would like to commemorate them once again and hope that Allah will bless them, and I would also like to say that we will continue with the struggle that they have passed on to us. And this is actually a very big contradiction. You keep saying that you have been actually treated unjustly, but then you resort to terrorism and carry out acts of terror. They're trying to silence us, actually, but we are not giving up, and we will not. And in the recent years, our country has made important leaps in terms of diplomacy, and in terms of its strategic geographical location, and in terms of considering its big state apparatus. Turkey has a very important role to play. Our diplomacy is very strong. Our foreign Ministry and other international organizations such as the Turkish Cooperation and Coordination Agency and Yunus Emre Institute, which are represented in more than 70 countries worldwide. Thanks to these organizations, we are able to raise our voice and make ourselves heard in the international arena. And seeing this, they had to turn back to politics, and then they tried to convince parliaments that their theses are right, and we are also fighting against these steps taken by them as well. And these circles, we have been passing a message to them tens of times. Our president said this too. We say we should leave this matter to the historians, open the archives and let them discuss this. But of course there is the future perspective, future dimension of this matter issue as well. Considering the current situation of Armenia, I think their steps will not benefit their own people as well. All of our calls have not been returned actually. They haven't responded to our calls, but we kept taking steps in this direction. And today, I was going to tell you about the numbers of the studies that we have carried out, but I just wanted to show you physically our books that are in our inventory, in our library. On my right, if my cameraman could show this, the Turkish Historical Society has published all of these books. We have around 117 books on this desk here on my right. And please have a look on my left. There you will see the State Archives Directorate and the Chief of General Staff have carried out studies and made these publications, as well as our universities, and these are their publications on my left. So this is a very serious effort, and these are very detailed and very hard works actually. And Mr. Hikmet Özdemir, Mr. Halaçoğlu, and Mr. Yusuf, they have all taken part in these publications and they have made great contributions. I would like to thank them. Atatürk University, Ankara University, and Atatürk Research Center, and other universities have carried out very important studies in the field of the events of 1915. We should also not forget about the Council of Higher Education. So far, there are 118 PhD theses and 443 master's theses on the events of 1915 so far. All of these are based on archives because, you know, history is something different. You may have your arguments, your theories, but if you are to speak about an event in history, then you should have a reference, a sound basis, and you should base everything you say in historical archives. And we have really carried out very important activities in this field, and I would like to thank all of the contributors, our institutions and organizations, and the general staff actually. And we have always been trying to channel the discussion into the field of history and the field of historians, but they keep trying to turn it into a political discussion, and we know what their ultimate goal is. I should also tell you that so far in the Greek issue, Armenian issue, the background actors, actually, we know who they are. We know them very well. The Armenians, the Balkan people communities, both in the Middle East and the Greek issue, they have always hidden behind them our subjects, and they haven't faced us directly. They've always hidden behind them, but we invite them to do this. We have very valuable diplomats, very distinguished and experienced politicians. Yes, we can wage this fight in the political field as well, but we invite them to stop hiding behind those other actors and face us directly. As you know, the Ottoman geography extended to a great, vast area, and they had to withdraw from some of this land. And in those areas that the Ottoman Empire had to withdraw, there was such immense suffering, such high loss of lives, mortalities. Look at the Balkans, the Middle East. Those areas still haven't reached peace. I mean, there's no peace and they are still suffering. So we tell again that we should leave this issue to the historians, and we should also speak about future. We are always stuck in the past and there are no more details that haven't been researched into. Both the Historical Society and other societies and institutions have looked into archives abroad as well. So there are no more documents to explore in this field. All of them have been investigated. I don't want to take too much of your time, and I'd like to leave the floor to the other speakers, and I would like to thank the Directorate of Communications and particularly the Director of Communications for organizing this conference. The facts are important. If the facts are with you, then even if the whole world unites against you, the facts will win. We would like to thank Professor Birol Çetin for his valuable contributions and for the archives that you have shared with us. It's very interesting. Now I would like to leave the floor to the Republic of Turkey Presidency's Director of Communications, Professor Fahrettin Altun, for his opening remarks.
Thank you so much, distinguished participants. I salute you all with respect and affection. Welcome to the International Conference on the Events of 1915, organized by the Presidency's Directorate of Communications. I hope that the opinions that will be shared here today will contribute to the revelation of the truth, because history can only be read accurately only thanks to humble and courageous people's belief in the truth. I would like to thank our distinguished panelists and everyone who will contribute to this significant conference for their valuable efforts. Distinguished participants, we can describe the 20th century as an extraordinary period that witnessed significant turning points of history. The 20th century was marked by world wars, the fall of empires, the change of boundaries, and the development of democracy. The world has gone through a major political transformation as if it was changing its shell. While centuries-long habits, borders, and administrations change, there were also great sufferings. The griefs experienced in almost every corner of the world were told to children not only by history books, but also by their parents through fairy tales and memories. While some incidents turned into myths and lost their connection with the truth, others were overlooked in the context of truth. The 20th century witnessed a very significant incident and three large empires dissolved at the end of the World War I. The Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Tsarist Russia went through transformations whose effects reach today. According to the records, 38 million civilians and soldiers lost their lives in this global war, where 65 million soldiers were mobilized. Considering the low population of the time, such a huge loss undoubtedly caused major traumas in all countries at war. Acting heroically at several fronts, our nation was severely affected by this war that cost the lives of millions of people. The Ottoman nation as a whole fought hard in the final parts of the empire. We fought hard in Çanakkale, Caucasus, Hijaz, Palestine, and Iraq. Including the Ottoman Empire, there was a huge conflict in all fronts of the war, and during the First World War, there were some incidents that caused great suffering for the people of Anatolia. In the same period, thousands of our soldiers were frozen and died, and they were martyred. And we know that there were some Armenian gangs that were cooperating with the enemy, and we know that while people from all segments of the Ottoman society united their forces for their homeland, certain gangs emerged in some areas, cooperating with the enemy and martyring hundreds of thousands of innocent people. And we know that tens of thousands of Turkish and Armenian people lost their lives in the eastern Anatolia. And we know that the Armenian Ottoman citizens in the eastern provinces were relocated to Syrian territory, and that was the 1915 relocation. And Armenians who lived in specific areas were relocated to protect civilians and defend the homeland under the conditions of warfare. While this measure was being implemented, unfortunately unfavorable events took place, and both Turks and Armenians lost their lives, and there was suffering. And all these things actually led to the basis of the discussions and the slanders that reach up today. As the Republic of Turkey, we share the suffering that happened during the enforcement of the relocation law enacted in 1915 by the Ottoman Empire. We regard it as a conscientious and ethical obligation to share the grief of our Armenian neighbors over the last century, and as well as a prerequisite to being Turkey altogether. As mentioned by our President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, we believe that being Turkey altogether means being together in grief and in happiness. We are faced with a narrative that attempts to distort the shared history of the Turkish and Armenian people that lived together in peace for centuries and to drive hostility from history. We are against this narrative because we care about all these sufferings over this land, and we consider them all the same, regardless of their past, religion, ethnic origin, or sect. We know that people lived on this territory as sisters and brothers for centuries. Distinguished participants, discussions regarding the events of 1915 are still ongoing even after a century. The reason for this is that there is persistence and obstinacy while dealing with the events of 1915 as a political and ideological issue. Some circles are trying to move it to the political ground and try to use them for imperial purposes. It's evident that constantly changing actual political approaches cannot address a century-old historical issue in a healthy manner. It's inevitable for such historical matters to be used for daily futile discussions when politicized. Therefore, the decisions taken by different parliaments will not make them democrats, but they will be actually overbearing. And the sufferings of the past, unfortunately, turn into a matter of interest for the politicians of today. And this is the greatest disrespect, in my opinion, for the victims and for their suffering. The primary aim of the Republic of Turkey is to serve truth and justice in every field. This fundamental perspective necessitates not only opposing today's injustices, but also addressing historical events fairly. And for this purpose, our struggle for truth is definitely for pure truth, veracity. Our aim to reach truth is not for a political purpose, but for the truth itself. And for this reason, our president made a call to open up the archives for the events of 1915 and to provide a scientific approach. This is a call for the truth, and our call for the truth is actually a sign of our sincerity about this matter. Distinguished participants, without a question, the best way to honor the victims is to see history from the perspective of fair memory. And the way to do this is to express what happened on this territory in the last century in a transparent, truthful, and scientific manner. And under the leadership of our president, the most comprehensive and sincere steps towards this goal have been taken. As you know, since 2015, the condolences were conveyed for the Armenians that lost their lives at the highest level. And last year, our president sent a letter to the Armenian Patriarch Mashalyan, and he said in his letter the following: "We are all aware of the circles working to create hostility out of the past by ignoring our unity that emerged from the bottom of Anatolia. While we desire and work for a future full of unity, prosperity, and tranquility, it's our important wish that the circles that aim for the opposite are not allowed." And this statement by our president is very meaningful, very significant. Distinguished participants, actually, the so-called Armenian genocide claim is the precursor of the phenomenon known as the post-truth today. It's a claim that has nothing to do with the facts, with the truth, and is based solely on political considerations. It's an illegitimate allegation that plays on emotions, and by means of a useful lie, we know that those who are attacking our countries are not concerned with the Ottoman Armenians or the historical sufferings. We know it very well. And Hrant Dink, the gallant son of this territory, said like this: "Who is our friend? Who will heal what happened in the past? Is it the decision of the French Senate, or is it the decision of the US Senate? Are they our friends?" The words, the expressions of Hrant actually clearly summarizes that the sufferings are used as a tool for imperialist motives. He was aware of this, and we are well aware of this. Distinguished guests, it has no meaning for us. The decisions taken by any parliament or the statements by any foreign head of state has no meaning for us. The important thing for us is to take our place in the hearts of the sons and daughters of these lands. Therefore, we will never get tired of pursuing the truth. Therefore, we believe that this conference will play an important role in preventing the pillaging of history, remembering the historical background of the events of 1915, and preventing the attempts to make our country kneel down through the slander of the so-called Armenian genocide. It's our great desire that the events of 1915 are fully understood through a scientific review and reflected to the international public in an accurate way. Within this framework, as the Directorate of Communications and all organizations and agencies of Turkey, we will do our best and we will continue to do so. And in this process, I would like to express my gratitude to the Turkish Historical Society, universities, relevant organizations and agencies, and particularly the researchers. I hope the truth and conscience will heal our wounds and contribute to peace and stability around the world. And I would like to salute you all with respect and love. Thank you. We would like to thank Professor Fahrettin Altun, Director of Communications, for his opening remarks and for his valuable contributions. He has made very important points and given very important messages to think on. Now we will be talking about the events of 1915 in the historical context and the Armenian issue. This is our first session, and Professor Yusuf Sarınay will be moderating the session, and the speakers are Professor Seyit Serçelik, Professor Mesut Uyar, Professor Oleg Kuznetsov, and Dr. Maxim Goin. And now I would like to leave the floor to Professor Yusuf Sarınay. Yes, please.
Evet, çok değerli izleyiciler. Ben
Dear
öncelikle
distinguished participants,
Cumhurbaşkanlığı İletişim
while starting my words, I would like to thank the Directorate of Communications for organizing such a significant and meaningful conference, and I would like to salute all of you with respect. Let me underline one point. I will give you a general perspective and then leave the floor to the distinguished speakers of this session. Some Western and some Armenian circles want to establish a causal relationship for some, do not wish to establish a causal relationship relating to the events in the history, and they just pick some information from the history and then they distort it. And the relocation of the Armenians and the process leading up to the relocation. We know there were rebellions, insurgencies of Armenians, and they're all trying to make us forget about all of these as a policy, and they're trying to draw the portrait that the Ottoman Empire relocated the Armenians in 1915 without any basis or sound reason, justification. And as a result of these manipulative efforts and the propaganda carried out in Western countries and in other parts of the world, there's this unilateral memory that they're trying to build. And the Armenian diaspora has turned this memory unilaterally into something that is out of discussion. So it is this myth of genocide that they use, which they're trying to use to replace the truth. And the judiciaries, if they approve this, then this will close up the scientific ground for discussion. So it is their perspective of convicting and holding someone to account and trying to make the other side feel guilty. So it is very judgmental, their attitude. But as in every other event in history, we have full confidence to discuss and to speak about this event in history as well. Back in 2005, our government proposed to establish a joint historical commission to the Armenian side so that the historical archives could be open and a joint commission could work on them. And this proposal is still very significant because the Turkish Archives Directorate has very transparently opened up all of its archives, and they have some information that can be confirmed by international archives as well. So that is why, based on this approach of just memory, fair memory, all the suffering that people have gone through the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire should be discussed jointly, actually. So there were massacres in the Balkans, in other parts of the empire, and there was also the Armenian issue, and this issue is one of the important events in the history, but it should be assessed from the big picture of the World War I, because the Armenian issue with the Berlin Agreement has gained an international dimension, and after that the Armenians have been encouraged by this international support, and with this international support they aspired to found independent, first an autonomous, then a fully independent Armenian state. But they didn't have the majority in any part of the Ottoman territory. That is why they resorted to armed terrorist acts. They set up gangs, organizations, and starting from 1890, they started rebellions, insurgencies in Merzifon, Kars, Samsun, and in many different provinces, also including an attempt of assassination at the ruler of the time. They incited more than 40 rebellions and carried out terrorist acts, and they turned the Anatolia into a place of fire until the 1900s. And we know that the Armenian committees were there, and there was pressure, oppression, and terrorism that they used as tools. And there were more than 3,000 ministers, pasha, academicians, and they were of Armenian origin, and they were serving in the Ottoman state. And during the Balkan Wars, the great defeat of the Ottoman Empire did encourage the Armenians, and they accelerated their effort towards founding a state for themselves. An important breaking point, an important development is in 8th of February 1914. There was the Yeniköy Agreement, which stipulated reforms for the Armenian lands there, and the Ottoman Empire had to sign this agreement with the pressure from external forces. And the provinces where there would be reforms, they tried to divide these lands and take them away from the Ottoman sovereignty. And around this reform area constituted around 20 provinces, and they forced the Ottoman Empire to sign and to enforce this agreement. It wasn't enforced because due to the conditions of World War I, but if it was enforced, then the Anatolian land would be divided, and between the Turkish and Armenians there would be such a division of the Anatolian land, and this was avoided luckily. And with the start of World War I, the Armenians considered this a great opportunity for them to found their own state, and they cooperated with the Russians and with the members of the parliament, and together with the Russians, they started fighting against the Ottoman Empire. In 1915, spring months, the Armenian committees, rebellions, sabotages, and the terrorist acts were starting to pose a threat to the national security of the Ottoman Empire, which was already fighting in multiple fronts. And in Sivas and Erzincan, the rebellions increased further, and in Kars, Ardahan, and Nahchivan regions, 30,000 Muslim Turks were martyred by Armenian committees. And these massacres increased, and they claimed the lives of 525,000 Muslim citizens back then. And also together with the Çanakkale battles, Istanbul was also under a threat. And then after Bitlis, Siirt, and Muş, Erzurum, there was a rebellion in May 18th, and it was a very big rebellion which burned the city down, and then they planned an attack on the Iskenderun Gulf as well, and this created further concerns for the Ottoman Empire. Until May 1915, there was not a predetermined relocation, dispatchment, and settlement policy. On 2nd of May 1915, there is a correspondence of the Ministry of Interior of the Ottoman Empire which confirms this. So this relocation is not predetermined or planned beforehand. It is a transitionary measure, temporary measure precaution that was taken to eliminate the threat. In early May, in Zeytun and Maraş, the insurgent Armenians were dispatched to Konya province, but there they made attempts to cut the supply of the army. Therefore, they were dispatched to the southern regions and areas such as Mosul, Aleppo, around Syria. And despite the decision of relocation, 3,000 Armenians were exempted from the relocation, including those in Istanbul particularly, and their property were preserved. And in 1918, those who returned were given back their property. Their properties were returned as well. The documents show us this. And it was also during the relocation, aid was possible to be dispatched. It was allowed, and also during the relocation, 1,673 people who attacked these Armenians who were being relocated and who caused problems for them were tried in 1915 and 16 in the Ottoman court-martial. And these included 170 government officials, district governors, and civil servants, and 975 people who were found to organizing gangs. So there were 524 convictions and also other fines and punishments that were implemented. So looking back at that period, there's not a central administration and Ottoman administration that had a predetermined relocation plan. If it was the case, it would not act such sensitively in terms of ensuring the safety of those people and punishing those who endangered their safety or who attacked them. So this is what I think we should keep advocating, we should keep defending. And now I would like to leave the floor to the very distinguished speakers of this session. First speaker will be Professor Seyit Sertçelik. He is the chief advisor to the president and a member of the Security and Foreign Policies Council, but we know him from the very significant studies he has carried out in regarding the events of 1915. He has his PhD in Russia, and he has very good knowledge of the Russian documents, historical documents regarding these events of 1915. And he has two very valuable publications that he has provided for use in the scientific world and for us. Now leave the floor to Professor Seyit Sertçelik. The floor is yours, sir.
Seyit Hocam sesiniz gelmiyor şey olarak ama.
We cannot hear you, Professor Seyit.
Ses
Hocam geliyor mu şimdi?
Can you hear me now? Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Sayın Başkan,
Distinguished
çok değerli meslektaşlarım.
directors, distinguished colleagues, I would like to extend my regards to each and every one of you.
Çok kapsamlı bir
Professor Yusuf made a very good introduction regarding the Ottoman archives. It was very good, and you summarized the events of 1915 in a very well manner. Thank you very much for that. Distinguished colleagues, in order to understand the events of 1915, I would like to take you back in history, because the event of 1915 is an outcome, is a result, and as the international public, while evaluating the events of 1915, we are misled by this result, this outcome, because the Armenian issue dates back in history. During the Ottoman Empire, the Armenians committed a mass massacre in 1828 and 1829. The Russian armies, when they occupied the eastern Anatolia in Doğu-Beyazıt, more than 1,000 civilian Muslims were killed by their neighbors who were Armenians. And the loyal nation is the name given to the Armenians during the Ottoman Empire, and by 1828, with the massacre of more than 1,000 Muslims, this name came to an end. And you cannot be called a loyal nation when you kill lots of people. And this information, distinguished participants, was taken from the Russian General Staff in their archives. And when the Russian armies occupied Doğu-Beyazıt in the eastern Anatolia, Armenians killed more than 1,000 civil Muslims in this part of Turkey, of the Ottoman Empire actually. And in 1826 and 27 there were Iran-Ottoman wars, and during these wars, thanks to the aids received, this war was won, and 4,000 Armenians living in Iran migrated to the territory of the today's Armenia. And before 1828, when you look at the Armenian sources, you see that 85 or 90% of the territory was a Muslim or Turkish territory. And Yerevan, that is the capital of Armenia today, was actually a place where 85% or 90% of the population were Muslims. And around 1827, 40,000 people were migrated to this area, and they tried to change the structure of this area, the fabric of this area, and they tried to establish a buffer zone there. And after Russia won the war, they started a new war against the Ottoman Empire, and 1828 and 1829 war actually led to the mobilization of all resources to the Armenians by the Russian army. And we know that the Russian army won this war with the help of the Armenians, and after this war in Doğu-Beyazıt, more than 1,000 civil Muslims were killed by Armenians. I told you about this, and they thought that there will be the revenge of it, and with this thought, 90,000 Armenians left the place they were living, and they wanted to migrate to the Russian Caucasus. But the Ottoman Empire was a very tolerant state, and the citizens who wanted to leave the country, they actually tried to stop them, and we know that the Armenians thought that the Turkish tribes would want blood revenge, would want blood void from them, and this is why they left this territory. And the Armenians who migrated actually started to change the demographic structure of this area and tried to create a buffer zone in this area. These results that we obtained from the historical documents are very important. I also have some information that I derived from the Armenian Patriarchate. This is important. 1851 and 1871. Between these years, there were Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire, and there were 4,079 offenses or crimes against the Armenians.
Öldürme, tecavüz,
These are the killings or rapes or injuries or some tax abuses. These are ordinary crimes, and the total number of those crimes or offenses against the Armenians in Turkey was 479. So you can ask a question at this point. Hundreds or thousands of people could be killed in an incident, but the Ottoman Empire did never attempt to have a mass massacre against Armenians. Therefore, this is an important point. In 20 years,
mahiyette 479 adet
479 crimes were committed against Armenians. And this fact is actually an important sign that there is no systematic massacre against the Armenians. And this is the information I obtained from the Armenian Patriarchate archives. I also checked the Russian archives and reviewed all the documents within the context of Caucasus, but I couldn't get any such information. And then the Russian Tsar was presented a file, and in the years 1903 and 1912,
bir yılda
there were
adet suç teşkil eden olayın olduğunu görüyoruz.
9,000 incidents or events that actually posed a crime, an offense. And there were Armenians and Georgians living, and Azeri people in that area. And we know that the Armenian and Georgian population were almost equal. So if you make a calculation here, we see that 3,000 criminal incidents occurred against Armenians. This was in 1 year in Russia and Caucasus, but in the Ottoman Empire between 1851 and 1871, 479 criminal incidents took place, and we see that up till 1890s there was no Armenian issue within the Ottoman Empire. In 1819s, the Armenian rebellion started in Anatolia, and
300 bin
as if there was a consensus about this, people started to say that 300,000 people were actually massacred in Turkey. That was the allegation. And until the Adana incident in 1909, we know that it's a lie that 300,000 Armenians were killed in the Ottoman Empire. This is not the case. And we know that the Russian consuls or the intelligence officers made some statements about this, and the diplomats, the intelligence officers say that the Armenians add a zero at the end of the figures they have. If one Armenian is killed, they add a zero at the end of it, and they say it is 10, and they express that 10 Armenians were killed, or if it's 10, it will be 100 in their statements, and we know that it's an important point. When it comes to 1914, the First World War started, and the Ottoman Empire was not involved in the war yet, but
son derece coşkuyla
we know that Armenians were very enthusiastic about the First World War. They welcomed it, in other words. Of course, there is no meaning if you welcome a war, if you are enthusiastic about a war. And the Ottoman Empire that was called the sick men
Ermeni aydınları özellikle de
were thought that, the Armenians thought that the sick man, the Ottoman Empire, was about to die, and we know that the Armenian intellectuals had the idea that there will be an independent state of Armenia, and this thought actually brought them to the edge of a war against the Ottoman Empire as a whole. Distinguished participants,
hasta adam olarak nitelenen Osmanlı Devleti'nin mirasını paylaşma derdine düşen sömürgeci devletlerin
when the imperialist forces that wanted to share the heritage of the Ottoman Empire that was called the sick man, they needed some internal powers to give the final knock. And therefore, the Tsarist Russia wanted the Ottoman empires, or saw the Ottoman empires as the final internal power to knock down the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Armenians, with the aspiration of having an independent state, found it favorable for them, appropriate for them, and it was considered an opportunity that should not be missed. It's a historical moment and an opportunity that should not be missed for the Armenians, because the Ottoman Empire was fighting on many different fronts, but the Armenians on the Caucasus front fought against the Ottoman Empire, and they started rebellions in the eastern provinces. Only around Zeytun and the surroundings, there were 40,000 insurgents who fought against the Ottoman Empire, according to the Russian archives. In the Caucasus front, we note that there were around 10,000 Armenians who were armed by the Russians, and they were considered as the voluntary units, and they fought against the Ottoman Empire. And according to some Armenian historians, the number there was 150,000 for some, and it was 300,000 for others. According to the Armenian authors, 1914 was the year when the Armenians took sides during the war, because the Armenians took side by the Entente states, and they did their part for this war to be won by the Entente states. They did their best. The Tsarist armies were cooperating with the Armenians, and the Armenians made it possible for one province to be captured by the Russians. And the Ottoman Empire warned the Armenian Patriarchate and said that they would take the necessary measures as long as the Armenians continued their rebellions, their acts. But the warnings turned no response. And in 1915, April 24, the Armenian intellectuals were detained, were arrested, and with the law enacted about with the settlement law enacted on May 20, 1915, the Armenians were relocated to safer places of the country, such as Mesopotamia or Syria, and many of them, most of them actually, reached the places they were relocated to. And according to the 1914 census data, we see that the Armenian population is 1 million in the Ottoman Empire at the time, and according to the official Russian statistics and archives, we see that the number of Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire was 1,300,000, because the Tsarist Russia actually developed very important projects in 1830s, and they were planning to occupy Anatolian territory and also Istanbul, and they were trying to take a snapshot of Anatolia, and there were intelligence officers, and they were trying to find all the resources of the Ottoman Empire, all the information regarding the climate and other resources. And when we look at the figures of non-Muslims and Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire, we see that this figure was very important for the Russian general staff, and this figure was calculated by the diplomats and the intelligence staff of Russia. This was an order given to them, because when the Russian army comes to Turkey to occupy, they knew that the Armenians would help them, and therefore the general staff of Russia did not want to see any surprise, and this is why they should have the accurate numbers. For this reason, the Russian sources tell that the number of Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire was 1,300,000, and I can tell you that this is an accurate number. According to the official Russian data, in 1915, 360,000 Armenians went from Turkey to Yerevan in Caucasus. And among those people who migrated, who went there, there were 40,000 Armenians, and they were there in Yerevan and died of contagious diseases and the cold weather. So they left Turkey, they went to Russia, and 40,000 Armenians lost their lives, and this was not caused by any massacre or any kind of genocide. Distinguished participants, what happened to 1,300,000 Armenians living in Turkey? During the war, those Armenians continued their lives safely, especially in Istanbul, and also in the western provinces. There were 300,000 Armenians, and they continued their lives safely. According to the Russian Migration Agency, there were 360,000 Armenians left Turkey and went to Russian territory. And before the war, in order to join the Russian army, there were Armenian young people who went to Russia, leaving Turkey. And before the war, again, they were trying to gain an earning and earn some money, and this is why they went to other places. And unfortunately, we're not well aware of the Iranian archives. I cannot give you the clear figure, but 300,000 Armenians who left Turkey, and also the Armenian youngsters who were in Europe before the war, and also the ones who went to Russia and Iran, the total number of Armenians who left Turkey before 1914, the figure was 500,000. This is a clear figure. 500,000 Armenians left Turkey. 300,000 Armenians continue to live in Turkey. So it is 800,000, and 300,000 of them continued their lives safely in Turkey. So, according to Russian and Armenian sources, I reviewed different documents for 8 years, and the conclusion I derive is that there were 150,000 Armenians who died on the Armenian territory. But according to the statements of Russian diplomats and officers in the 1890s, we see the same habit of Armenians, that is to add another zero at the end of the figure they have. I mean, they are actually trying to tell the lie that 1.5 million Armenians died in Turkey during the First World War. The exact, apart from the Armenians who lost their lives for different reasons, we can tell you that there are 40,000 Armenians who lost their lives in this period, especially when we look at the Armenians who were fighting against the Ottoman Empire in Russian uniforms in Caucasus. Their number was 150,000 or 300,000. So, it's something between 150 or 300,000, 150,000 and 300,000. Therefore, we know that 200,000 Armenians fought against the Ottoman Empire in Caucasus, and we know that they lost their lives while fighting against the Ottoman Empire. While they were firing against the Ottoman Empire, of course they were shot, and the number of them was 100,000. So more than 150,000 of Armenians actually lost their lives on the front while fighting against the Ottoman Empire. And there were around 900 voluntary units, Armenian units, and they actually were fighting at the front line. And while the Russian tried to capture one province, and they were really bloody-handed gangs, and where around 500,000 Muslims were killed killed in this area, and they were killed by the voluntary Armenian units.
Şimdi Sovyet döneminin önemli tarihçilerinden Ermeni asıllı
We have an important Armenian historian from the Soviet period, and this historian actually summarizes the events of the First World War. I would like to share his statement with you, and according to Boryan's statement, the rebellion of the Armenians
tarihi ve hukuki bir hakkıydı.
was a historical right for the Armenians. If the state actually tries to suppress the rebellions, this is also a right for the state to suppress them. So in 1914, during the First World War, Armenians actually fought a war of independence for them. And while waging this war, they were aware of the fact that they would have lots of casualties, and therefore they had some casualties. And according to another important Armenian historian, Ashak Chobanyan, it stated that in similar crises, there is exaggeration. And it's not a fact that the Armenians were killed in Turkey. This is Ashak Chobanyan who said this in 1915-16. And during the First World War, there were very important magazines published in Russia, Armenian magazines these are, and there were around 20,000 pages of magazines, and I read all of them. And at the beginning of the war, these magazines told that there were Armenians killed in Turkey. It was around 250,000, and then it was 500,000, and it reached up to 800,000 as the time passed. So, according to the Armenian magazines published in Russia, it was said that there were Armenians killed in Turkey, and the number of those people who were killed increased gradually. And when we came to 1916 or 17, the figures changed the figures, and the magazine said that thank Allah, thank God, Armenia will have Armenians and will not run out of Armenians. This was a heading in the magazine. So this shows that there was no such high number of Armenians. There was no killing of Armenians in Turkey. And we see that this is not the truth. We understand that they wrote all these things because of their propagandas, and these are just exaggerated figures, and we see that these exaggerated figures were there, but we also understand that they were really happy because there were not huge numbers of casualties, and they said that in the Armenian magazines. The claim that 1.5 million Armenians were killed was actually written in different newspapers and magazines in Russia, France, and Armenia, and these were based on exaggerated figures. And today, we see that the figures given in those magazines was 800,000 or 1 million, but today, unfortunately, the Armenian historians pose these figures as if they were correct. And considering the extraordinary conditions of the period, the decision of relocation was inevitable. And in terms of international law, this is a state decision which is legitimate. And we see similar practices in history and also in today's world. The decisions, the initiatives taken by states, considering the war conditions, have a place in international law, but it has nothing to do with the term genocide in international law. Of course, the historical events should be reviewed in a good manner, and I need to make a criticism here. Turkish historians do not compare history or do not conduct comparative history. And with regards to comparative history, I can tell you that the Ottoman Empire
dönemde yani Birinci Dünya Savaşı
took the decision of relocation, and we know that it's very important that similar decisions were taken in different countries during the First World War. For instance, in the Tsarist Russia, there were Germans and Jews living in the western part of the country, and thousands of hundreds of them were transferred to another place with no meaningful justification, just based on some suspicion, and around 1 million Germans or Jews that cooperated, based on the suspicion that they cooperated with Germany, were transferred to the central Russia, going tens of thousands of kilometers away. So the Russians did a similar thing, made a similar thing during the First World War. They displaced those people as well. Considering the cold climate of Russia, we know that they traveled under this cold climate, and tens of thousands of people lost their lives during their travel.
Dünya Savaşı döneminde Çarlık Rusyası'nın Musevi ve
But
Alman yurttaşlarına karşı bir katliam veya
did you know that the Tsarist Russia actually displaced Jews and German citizens during the First World War? Did you hear any such claim? No. Did you hear any such claim that the Russians committed genocide against these people? No. But unfortunately, we can hear such claims against the Ottoman Empire. When we look at the relocation of Russia for the Germans and the Jews, we know that the relocation decision taken by the Ottoman Empire cannot be considered as genocide. We know that it's a rightful decision. There is something more important. As you know, in 1918, there was the Dashnak Armenia, and of course, thousands of Bolsheviks were exiled to Soviet Azerbaijan, and the Azerbaijani Turks embraced the Armenians coming there. They did their best to help them survive. They used all their means. Professor Said, you are going very well, but we're running out of time. Can you please wrap up? I'm about to conclude. Thank you. So in this period, we see that Bolshevik Armenians were killed by Dashnaks, and they were jailed and killed. And so we see that when those people were killed, the Armenians had no rightful claim to say that the Ottoman Empire actually caused the events of 1915. Because when we look at the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1917 and 1918, we see the first mass massacre or mass killing of Europe there. And with the approval of Germany, the Russian community were actually killed based on the suspicion that they could cooperate with the Russian army, and they were either shot dead or they were executed capital punishment. And this can be considered the first mass massacre of the 20th century. And there was a circular published by Karl I of Austria, and they said that not all the detained are actually guilty, but they were detained for not being guilty. Let me conclude. During the First World War, Armenians had certain sufferings. And the Turkish historians, unfortunately, do not focus on this dimension. I mean, there were lots of people who fled from the eastern Anatolia into central Anatolia because of those voluntary units, because of the Armenian voluntary units, and they were killed by those units. Therefore, during the war, both the Armenians and the Turks and the Kurds suffered significant griefs, and they had to leave their lands and go away. When we look at the events of 1915 based on historical documents, we see that the Ottoman Empire took the decision of relocation, and when we look at the analysis conducted, there was no ethnic cleansing of Armenians in Anatolia, because from the past up to today, this fact was confirmed by many parties, and we see that the Armenians who migrated died because of the climate or war or other reasons. And the such allocations, I mean, the people who made such allegations were punished by the Ottoman officials. And also, we see that there were many similar incidents of relocation or exile in other empires during the war. Therefore, the claim, the argument, the allegation that there was a massacre or there was a killing of Armenian people in the Ottoman Empire, we can say that this is not true. Thank you very much for your attention. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much, Professor Seyit, for giving us information based on Russian and Armenian archives. And we should ask the question how Revan turned into Yerevan. And also, you pointed at the role of Russia in this process. I would like to thank you very much again. Now, I would like to invite the next speaker, Professor Mesut Uyar. He is working for Antalya Bilim University, and in the past he worked in other countries abroad, and he is interested in military history of Turkey, and he is interested in war and military history. His topic is military history and the events of 1915. Professor Mesut, I would like to ask you to keep on time in 20 minutes. Thank you very much.
Distinguished Chair, thank you very much. And the Presidency's Directorate of Communication, I would like to thank them as well for their invitation. First of all, what I would like to say is, I'm a military historian, actually, and the events of 1915, I look at them from a military history perspective, and I use them as much as I can use them in my own studies. My field of expertise is Armenians relocation. I mean, it is not Armenians relocation or genocide studies. As a military historian, one important point that I would like to share is that our approach to this topic, as mentioned by the president of the Turkish Historical Society, he said that both the state, he showed us the state publications and other publications of different organizations and universities that have been published, and there are lots of them. But if you look at the publications of military historians in the market, you cannot see these books that were shown by the president of the Turkish Historical Society. Maybe then they will think, why aren't they using these? I mean, are they prejudiced, and is that why they're not using them? First of all, the events of 1915 happened in time of war, during the World War I, and the decision to relocate was related to military reasons and about the capacity to fight in the war. And this issue also relates to military history as well. But this issue, this topic, has not been investigated in detail from the perspective of military history. So far, regarding the events of 1915 in Turkish and in other languages, the publications that have been published have not been used by military historians. And regarding the publications not just published in Turkey, but also in other countries, other academicians, Armenian or other nationals, their publications have not been very useful for military historians as well, because military history is a lot related with economic history, which means we should have the figures, precise, accurate figures, if possible, and if not, overall figures, and we should have a databases made up of figures that we should rely on. Back in August 3, 1915, when there was mobilization, in February 1914, in the Caucasian front and in other fronts in March 1915, the Armenians were transferred to different units within the military, different battalions. And these battalions actually, and these labor battalions and those behind the front they say, the hinterland battalions, they say they have been massacred intentionally. And they say that it is actually like those in Hollywood movies, that you see those practices that were carried out in Turkey during the wartime as well. The military historians cannot use these allegations in favor or against them, because we don't have the net figures. We don't know the number of soldiers who have been recruited, or the reserve officers who have been non-commissioned officers who have been recruited, or how many of them were Armenians. In February, March 1915, how many Armenians were transferred to labor battalions, how many labor battalions there were, and what is the ratio of Armenians within the labor battalions, and which other ethnic groups were included in the labor battalions, and what is their rate, what are their figures. So how many Armenians were killed, injured, or were enslaved due to the war, and how many of them were released after the war? I mean, how many of them were disbanded once the war ended? We don't know these figures. We don't have net figures. We don't know how many soldiers have been recruited by the Ottoman Empire and what happened to them. I mean, numerically, quantitatively, we don't have any sufficient data. We don't have robust data. We have just some general data that we're trying to use to reach outcomes, but it is not possible. We don't have a database that we can rely on. But it is a very important detail, because we have to know this to make an assessment from the perspective of military history. Otherwise, the publications will not be of much worth for us, because they have all these general information and no specific details that may be of interest for military historians. And the events of 1915 actually are not dealt with by the military historians unless they have to. And if they have to do this, they just summarize the prevalent Armenian genocide claims or allegations, like this one, like an introduction book, a reference book that they can use. This book includes a chapter on the Armenian issue, the events of 1915, and it also mentions the Armenians in other chapters as well. So they take such an introduction book, and they use this as the basis for their studies. And when we don't have these net figures, then this gap is being filled by newspaper articles or some other words that people say, the rumors. For example, there was a diary which was published by the İş Bankası Kültür Publication House in Turkey. It was the diary of a corporal back from that time. It said that some Armenian soldiers were killed on the front while the front was visited by the Turkish soldiers, the Ottoman soldiers. But unless you have the net data on this, then this will just keep expanding, and it will keep disseminating, and it will be in all the other publications as well, but it will be of no use. So it is not just about the figures that we will use this, but also, as Mr. State mentioned, this will give us a general perspective of the events of 1915. I mean, their place within the whole process of World War I. I mean, what is the place of events of 1915 in the general world history as a whole? So the military history investigations will help us with that. It is the relocation which triggered these incidents. So what is relocation? What is its definition? In modern times, how long has it been used? And what are the general problems that may be encountered during the relocation? During World War I, there was an example from Russia given by Mr. Sayed, where there are other relocations as well in different parts of the world in the same period. And these relocations, in comparison to the relocation in the Ottoman Empire, what do we see? These are important. First of all, the general characteristics and the problems created by the relocation should be known by all of us. But both the Turkish and foreign historians, while investigating the events of 1915, solely focus on the Ottomans and the Armenians. This is where they put their focus on, and they, in a way, isolate them from the other integral parts of such incidents. For example, there are different incidents of examples of this in world history as well. So when we first define the problem in general, then we can start dealing with the spatial characteristics of the Ottoman-Armenian relocation issue. Of course, it has its own specific properties in addition to the general characteristics that all relocations share. So far, the specific problems related to the events of 1915 have not been distinct very well and separated very well, distinguished well. But these are not the specific problems that we're discussing. These are just the general characteristics that all incidents of this kind have. Edward Erickson, an American professor, wrote some articles and has a compiled book which puts focus on this issue, defining the general context of the events of 1915. Now, maybe you would ask why Turkish military historians do not dwell on this issue, work on this issue, and we are sort of blamed actually for not doing this and for not making publications in this field. But actually, I should tell you that we have historians who study wars in Turkey. Yes, we have them, and their numbers are increasing recently, but the number of military historians is very low. Apart from a few master's degree levels in Turkey in the field of national defense, in national defense universities, we don't have too many faculties or departments in this field. Of course, some professors, some lecturers have with their own efforts are lecturing in this field, but it is not the main department actually. And the war studies are not also recognized by the Council of Higher Education. So we are not training military historians with a set curriculum. So because we are not raising them, training them, we are not able to produce publications that are important in this field. And this actually is a kind of a personal information I wanted to share with you. Now let me end my verse by asking what we should do and trying to answer this. First of all, in universities, war studies and military history should have a better place. It should be defined by the Council of Higher Education as a doctorate level, and they should be able to find jobs when they graduate from these departments. And secondly, the number of publications that can be used by the military historians should be produced all over the world. Regarding World War I, regarding the Ottoman Empire, that we should have 4 or 5 publications that we should be able to read, and also the international, some foreign military historians, if they want to work on this issue, they have to learn Turkish and just be able to read the very few number of publications in this field in Turkey. And because they're not able to read them, study them, and because there are not sufficient publications, they are making wrong references in their publications abroad. So we should train the military historians who will make the publications that will be of use for people, historians working in this field, both in Turkey and abroad. And also, the top-down approach has lost its popularity in history. During the times of war, people just want to learn about what happened to the individuals. And this has become much more popular. While we mark the centennial of World War I, people just wanted to know what happened to their great-great-grandfathers during the war. And I also receive many demands, requests from historians and people from Iranian, Arabic, and Greek Turks. They're trying to reach to me and asking me to find information about what happened to their ancestors during the war. So if we can write those stories that will give them the right answers, I mean, some examples were provided. If we also put the name in an example, I mean, an Armenian soldier from his recruitment in the army from 1914 until his disbandment, if we give a clear story and the name also included, then it will solve most of our problems. If we don't do this, what will happen? If we don't do this, the Turkish academicians and schools abroad, we will even have difficulty convincing them about our arguments. And the number of important publications, when we look at them, that support the Armenian thesis in the last 10 to 15 years, they were authored by Turkish academicians. So seeing this, I mean, our arguments and our theses are not being told to the Western public opinion, international public opinion, and we're at the point of trying to convince our own academicians about our own arguments and our theses. So let me close my words here and not test your patience. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Mesut, for your sensitivity about time and for giving us a different perspective, looking from a different window, from the military perspective. You provided us general information on the events of 1915, and this perspective, I believe, is very important, and I think that we should put more emphasis in that field in the Turkish academic world. So I would like to thank you once again. Now I would like to leave the floor to Professor Oleg Kuznetsov. Mr. Kuznetsov, he worked in different universities, currently in Baku, Azerbaijan, University of Languages. He's working as a professor. The Russian Army, military history, and Armenian terrorism are his fields of study mainly, and terrorism is an ideology of the Armenian nationalism, and it is their systematic practice. This is one of a quote from Oleg Kuznetsov. The floor is yours, sir.
Господа, за возможность принять участие в столь представительной и очень значимой для меня конференции. Я благодарю
Giving me this opportunity.
Турецкой Республики за то, что
I would like to
я
thank
могу
the
высказать
Republic of Turkey
свою
and
точку
the
зрения, которая во многом отличается от
official
официальной
institutions of the Republic of Turkey, and I would like to share my opinions with you. And it's very important for me to tell my opinions to you. And this is a difficult mission, and we need to observe a balance between politics and also the political conjunctures as well as good sense. And I will clearly try to explain the events of 1915 from my perspective, not only in the Ottoman Empire but also around the world. The First World War is an incident that had universal effects, and therefore the people were also affected by it. And from this perspective, I can tell you that it has a universal and also unique impact, and these impacts occurred in many different countries. And at the beginning, I would like to talk about the military crimes, especially in 1912. This occurred in the First Balkan War, and there was an international commission established with the support of the India-Carnegie Institute of the US, and there were representatives from Europe, and they tried to handle the military crimes committed in the Balkans. And there was a representative from Russia as well, and he was from the Democrats party group. He was an opponent leader, but he was the part of this commission, and there was a report published by this commission in 1915 in Geneva. Let me try to share it with you. This report was published in 1915 in Geneva, and because of the First World War, this report did not draw enough attention. And when I read this report, I realized something, because the first genocide in legal terms, according to the Nuremberg decisions, the victims of the first genocide were the Turks in the Balkans, because they were exiled from Macedonia and Greece during the war, and there are lots of documents to prove this point. There are such crimes, and these crimes prove that the events of 1915 were not the first ones to occur in history. There were some similar incidents or events in the past. There were also mass killings in the past. And when we look at 1915 events, we know that, as many panelists told, that there were many countries there where people were exiled. I mean, they exiled different communities, different people to secure their lands. And they did this for the purpose of military security. And in 1915, there was an exile in the Russian Empire because the Germans and the Jews were exiled from the eastern provinces, eastern parts of the country, and the Muslim population was exiled from the Caucasus. Therefore, we also know the French example. For instance, the French were exiled from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There was also an interesting incident in the South Africa because there were soldiers in Namibia. 900 German soldiers were there, and the rest of the army was struggling against the South Africa dominion, and during this event, the British were really brutal against the South Africa, and the events in the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the Ottoman Empire were nothing when compared to them. And nobody is talking about them. They are not a part of our agenda because this was a practice of the past that happened in the past. And everyone took measures, all countries took measures to ensure the security of their own countries. And all the countries that were in war actually used their own people against their enemies. This happened in the Caucasus front, and it was very widespread in this front. I don't know how the Turkish side will address this point, but in 1914, the Ottoman army started to move, and the Russian army was supported by the local elements, and there was a religious element in the First World War, and all the parties fighting used religion as an instrument in this war. And in 1916, we saw some rebellions in Russia and also Chechnya, and there were some troops intervening the process, and they were really brave, and they suppressed such rebellions. And they were also given awards or medals for their courage in the suppression of these rebellions. We can tell that the Russian troops had Armenians in them, and those Armenians were used against the Ottoman Empire during the First World War, and also there were some units that were created by the subjects of the Ottoman Empire, and also in the Ottoman Empire there were Azeri people, and I mean the people from the Muslim territories, and they took sides with the Ottoman Empire. And we see a similar practice in Southern Caucasus. So this was a natural thing of that time, and We know that the national troops were not only composed of Armenians in Russia, but there were also Czech people involved in them. And during the Civil War, there were some admirals of different nationalities. So I can tell you that this was a natural practice, an ordinary, normal practice to weaken your enemy and also to strengthen your forces and to use your economic resources in the most favorable way. And during the First World War, this was not something extraordinary. This is why here we are discussing the events. While discussing the events of 1915, we can tell you that what happened in the Ottoman Empire was not something different from what happened in other parts of the world, in other empires. There is another important point as well. The human brain or the human conception is not always realistic about the past, about the historical events, because we have a heritage passed on to us, and now we have drugs such as antibiotics and other pharmaceuticals, and they appeared after 1943, after the invention of penicillin. But before that, during the wars, there were people who died because of health reasons. We know that people at the front died because of health reasons rather than the act of fighting. Therefore, we can say that people will not die because of health reasons today, because we have the drugs and the measures. If people are in war today, for instance, let me give an example, they would not die of health problems, they would die of the act of fighting. But the situation in the past, during the First World War, was different. There were also state policies introduced by many different states, and the state policies also influenced the events that occurred. I mean, some people during the war would already be dead because there were no drugs. For instance, there was no penicillin, and there were epidemics, and for these reasons people lost their lives. I mean, there were natural factors, biological factors that affected the mortality rate then, and we know that there were actually the medical troops within the army. We knew that, but the civilians did not have any medical aid, did not have any means to receive medical aid, and they had to survive somehow. So I believe we should be considering all these points in the modern world as well. And this is a very important fact, and it is an important fact for us to understand the events of the past in a good manner. We know it very well that the Ottoman Empire sent troops to the Caucasus, 3 troops to the Caucasus, and 2 of them died of the cold weather. And when it was the spring of 1915, we saw the corpses that were frozen to death. And there was also cholera epidemic because of these corpses. And there were people from different ethnic origins, and those people died because of this epidemic. It was because of a health problem. It's not correct to say that this is a state policy. It's ridiculous to say that it's a state policy because it was not just a certain group of people that died. Other people died as well, and we know that ideologically the Armenian side has their own purposes, has their own goals, and this is why they're telling all these things about the events. But we can ask a question here: on which basis should you develop your ideology and say that there was that caused the events of 1915? Because after the First World War, people did not know the word genocide. There was no such term, there was no such word for it. So we can now try to find when this term emerged. And when we look at Mr. Badam's bibliography, and it was published in the past, and we can look at the references from different books like this. I have lots of books in my library, and I check my books and try to find out when the term genocide emerged. It was not even after the World War II. It was much later. It emerged much later in the midst of 1960s. This is when it was invented, and there were two elements in relation to it. The first one is the Turkey's admission to NATO, and the second one is the American missiles were located in Turkey, and this is why in the Soviet Armenia, this triggered some events because there was a decision taken by the Armenian Communist Party, and they wanted to build a mausoleum against the Turkish state, and they started to put forth their claims. And they turned the historical institute into the Armenian Sciences Institute. What does this mean? This means that they are serving for their purpose. They are creating a new ideology in their fight against Turkey. Why? Because there was a need to block this southern part of the NATO front, and this is why they resorted to the solution of the Armenian issue. They used the Armenian issue as a solution for this, and this was a product of the Cold War era. I mean, the Armenian issue came up as a product of the Cold War era. And it is also a product of the struggle between the geopolitical blocs. Therefore, the so-called Armenian genocide in the Ottoman Empire has no connection with the historical facts. I can sincerely tell you that there are two different histories here. One is written in Russian and Armenian, and the other one is written in English. Let me present you some examples so that you can compare. There were some Russian and the British works, and according to the Russian resources, the Lebanon rebellion was mentioned, and it was said that as a result of this rebellion, 40,000 Armenians were killed. According to the British resources, in the rebellion, 12,000 Armenians were killed. I mean, these are not the Lebanon, these are the Armenian rebellions I'm talking about, sorry. And they wanted to attract them to their side. And the Assyrians fought against the Ottomans as well, and the Assyrians were supporting the British. So it's the same event, the same incident, and we have resources for the same event. And I can tell you
И в этом смысле налицо двуличие и идеологический характер тезиса о геноциде армян.
And we see the ideological side of it.
Конкретно можно говорить о том,
Of course, we can tell clearly that the context is very important.
изначально предопределялся как инструмент идеологического давления.
This context was actually used as an ideological tool for the ideological struggle, and it was used for the consolidation of the Armenian diaspora so that they can struggle against Turkey. And in today's world, we know that the Warsaw Treaty collapsed, and the Armenians now have their state in the former Soviet territory, and
Тем более то, что сейчас происходит в Республике Армения, под глубочайший экономический и политический кризис, которым мы являемся все,
the Republic of Armenia is in a great economic and political depression, and it doesn't have a normal functioning ethnic state. They couldn't achieve it. This is what happens in Armenia right now. They wanted an ideological unity, alliance. They wanted to have an ethnic state, but we know that the ethnic minorities do not constitute even 2% of the population, and there are no Muslims in Armenia. There are some Jews and Yazidis, and there are 6 Muslims, they say, in Armenia, and one of them is the Mufti. Therefore, they are trying to have a mono-ethnic state there. So this is the reflection of their ideology, and here we see that it's a product of the mentality that was created in 1960s, and we see such allegations there. But I can tell you that this created, they created a monoethnic state, and they were encouraged to do so. And it was first thought that it would be created on the Turkish territory, but later on, the event of 1918 occurred, and then we see the today's Armenia was established in its current place, and we know that there was the peace, Batumi Peace Treaty, and then the Russian Empire collapsed and the Soviet Union collapsed. I would like to raise a point in this context. Russia has always supported the Armenians, and this is why they lost. For instance, Dashnaks, they had a role in the collapse of Russia, and they fought against the Ottoman Empire, and the Dashnak people in 1991, they provoked the Karabakh War, and they actually attacked or targeted the unity of the Soviet Union, and they actually accelerated its collapse. So we can say that it's the joint enemy, it's our joint enemy, and we need to cooperate together. I mean, the Turkish and the Russian scientific people, scientific community should be in cooperation, and we should analyze this matter from different perspectives and bring the truth to our people. Can you please wrap up? We need to further strengthen our efforts. I would like to apologize for being late. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your interest.
Ben bütün izleyenler adına sizlere teşekkür ediyorum.
Provided your perspective from a different angle, I would like to use the time efficiently. Now I'd like to leave the floor to Maxim Goin. Since 2012, he is working as a fellow academician at Eurasian and also he is interested in the Armenian issue and the Turkish-French relations. He has many scientific works in these fields, and he will be talking about a constant or continuous genocide claim and the role of Armenian and Greek nationalists in the unnecessary immigration of the Armenians from the Ottoman Empire to Atatürk. Can you please conclude on time in 20 minutes? We kindly ask you to do so. Thank you. Yes, please.
Of course, I will limit myself to the requested time. Briefly, as an introduction, I would like to emphasize that one of the trends of the Armenian nationalist literatures of the 1960s, when the genocide allegation emerged in the international public sphere, was to allege a continuity of the Ottoman and Turkish policies from Abdülhamid II to the Turkish national movement led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, and also to allege a Christian genocide, that the Turks are barbarians, they kill all the Christians, and so on. It often has an implicit or an explicit anti-Semitic dimension, because at the end of 19th century, it was alleged that Jewish bankers, with quotation marks, were behind Abdülhamid II, and later it was alleged that the Committee Union and Progress in power in the Ottoman Empire was controlled by Jewish Freemasons. This kind of nonsense you can read in Armenian literature until today, actually. So many arguments, and this extreme thesis of Christian genocide, continuity, etc., is experiencing a revival since 2010, roughly. during the last 10 or 12 years. Many arguments have been debunked regarding the Armenian, Assyrian, Greek cases by many historians, such as Edward Erickson or Stefan Yazimos, but one argument did not receive the attention it deserves, namely the supposed disappearance of Anatolian Armenians. So very often, when you have debunked many arguments, the ultimate response is yes, but there is no Armenian in Anatolia anymore, so this was genocide. I will answer this argument specifically, focusing on three periods, three aspects. First, the relocation by the Russian army in 1915-16 and the Russian withdrawal. Then the French occupation of Chukurova of Adana region and the French withdrawal. And my third and last part will be about the Greek Turkish War and the Greek scorched earth policy of destruction that provoked immigration of Greek and Armenians from Western Anatolia. So first part, the Russian offensives attacks of 1915 and 16 made a large part of Eastern Anatolia a war zone. As a result, as it has already been said actually, about 300,000 Ottoman Armenians have been relocated by the Russian forces, including the Armenian Volunteers Unit. And according to an official statement of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, of the oldest Armenian nationalist party, this same party took part to this relocation. According to the official data of the Armenian Republic, roughly the half of these people died by lack of food and because of diseases during or right after the relocation of 1915-16. It means a mortality rate of 50%. Yet, the mortality rate of the Ottoman Armenians relocated by the Ottoman army is, as far as can we know, between 40 and 50%. So the mortality rate was the same, or perhaps even higher, in the Russian relocation. This is something to be known and to emphasize, I think. Yet, even when the region was secured after the Russian conquest, the Tsar's authorities were reluctant to repatriate a lot of these surviving Armenians because they preferred to set Cossacks in these conquered territories, but also, and perhaps even more, because the systematic killings of Muslims by the Armenian units of the Russian army made the Armenians unpopular in the Russian administration. Michael Reynolds has found very striking, very clear Russian documents in this regard. Moreover, the Russian Revolution of 1917 caused a collapse of the Russian troops on the Eastern Anatolian front, and as a result, an Ottoman reconquest in 1917 and even more 1918. Yet, the remaining Armenians of the Russian forces took profit of the mass departure of both Russian officers and soldiers to commit a third wave of killings against the remaining Muslim populations and an unprecedented wave of destruction of Muslim property. According, one more time, to the official statistics of the Armenian Republic, forwarded to the French military attaché in the Caucasus, Pierre Chardini, 50,000 Armenians fled Eastern Anatolia in 1917-1918, which means that the number of refugees increased in what is today Armenia, increased until 200,000. And one more time, according to these official statistics, this number was reduced to 150,000 by the epidemics in Yerevan in 1918-1919. So, we see that Armenian nationalism was particularly destructive for its own population in Eastern Anatolia at several stages of the First War. But this is far from being the end of this sad history. So my second part is about the French occupation of Adana and the withdrawal from this region. First of all, I want to specify that contrary to a persistent myth, France never promised an Armenian state in or around Adana and never said what exactly the boundaries of Armenia in the Caucasus will be. On the contrary, the French government refused to accept the establishment of an Armenian state in Adana and refused to say what exactly the boundaries will be. Regardless, it is true that at the beginning of the occupation, so the end of 1919 and the very first months of 1919, occupation of Adana, I mean, attempts were made to use Armenians as clients to justify a permanent domination of France in this rich region, particularly as far as the production of cotton was concerned. Because one of the main problems of the French imperialists was the lack of production of cotton in their colonies. So there were Armenians who were not been relocated from Adana to Syria, 10,000 according to the French official statistics, and there were even more Armenians who were repatriated from Syria to Adana, Mersis, Tarsus. I will say Adana to be short, but of course it means surrounding parts of Turkey. So about 60,000 people were repatriated by the French forces in 1980. Moreover, the Armenian nationalists of Adana invited Armenians of Konya and Kayseri, who had not been relocated in 1915-16, to come to Adana, Tarsus, Mersin, etc., with the aim to change the demographic balance. Because as the French said, we cannot create an Armenia here because you are in minority, the idea was we will change the majority and we will force the French to accept an Armenia here. Meanwhile, the criminal behavior of the Armenian Legion, an auxiliary unit under the French command, supposed to be under the French command, and the fierce resistance of the Turkish population to the domination made these plans impossible as early as September 1919. As early as September 1919, the French policies begins to change and to see Armenian nationalism as dangerous and Armenians are as dubious clients. The Armenian Legion was purged as early as February 1919, then purely and simply suppressed in summer 1920. Similarly, the kind of pogrom against the Muslims of Adana in July 1920 was repressed by the French authorities by summary executions, and the not less than three attempts to proclaim an Armenian or Christian republic in Adana were blocked by the French forces in August and September 1920. Yet, these fights and crimes created distrust, to say the very least, between the communities. Meanwhile, I have no time to give you the details, meanwhile the French policies finished to change and it was decided to evacuate, to leave this occupied region, and that's why the Ankara Agreement was signed on October 20, 1921, about the withdrawal of the French occupation troops. After this agreement, the Armenian National Council of Silesia, the umbrella organization of the three Armenian nationalist parties and of churches, decided openly the mass immigration of the Armenians, with the firm support of Greece and of the British Armenia Committee. The role of the British government is unclear, so I will not enter into this issue. Yet, the Ankara Agreement provided an amnesty and other guarantees, but all that was called irrelevant, negligible by the Armenian nationalists, which was not the case. And the stronger guarantees of the Deadborn Agreement of March 1921, and even the Sèvres Treaty, which was so humiliating for Turkey, were previously considered by the same Armenian and Greek nationalists to be totally insufficient. So the problem is not with the content of the Ankara Agreement, the problem was with the very fact that the French will leave. The Armenian nationalists did not want their co-religionists to continue to live in an independent Turkey. That was their main concern. And the Greek nationalists, of course, did not want anything of this kind. Even more strikingly, the immigration rate of the Armenians from Mersin, Tarsus, and Adana at the end of 1921 was 99%. But the immigration rate of the Assyrians was 55%. Yet, the Assyrian religious leadership was very against the Turks, and some Assyrians took part to killings of Turks in 1920. So this is arithmetic evidence that Turkophobia of the leadership and participation of some people to crimes against the Turks, the fear of reprisals, are far from being enough to explain this immigration. To finish with this part, both French and Turkish authorities decided to create, at the end of 1921, joint commissions to take care of the Christian abandoned properties, with a very clear aim to tell to these people who were leaving after 1, 2, or 3 months, do you miss your shop? Do you miss your house? Yes? Just go back to Adana, go back to Mersin. Your shop, your house is waiting for you. But what happened to the Armenians who accepted to be members of this joint commission? They were threatened to death by who? By Turks? No, by Armenian nationalists themselves. This is one more time proof that the Armenian nationalists did not want coexistence and did their best, if I may say their best, to prevent such a coexistence. And the result was the unnecessary immigration of about 60,000 persons only at the end of 1821. So if there are almost no Armenians in Adana today, this is largely because of the Armenian nationalists themselves and other policies after 1980. My third and last part will be about the Greek Turkish War of 1919-1922. Indeed, Western Anatolian provinces, particularly the provinces of Izmir and Kütahya, were largely spared during the forced relocation of 1915-16. Most of the Armenians, about 99% of Armenians of Kütahya and Izmir, were not relocated at all. However, as early as May 1919, a minority, I insist, a minority of Armenians of Izmir took part to assassinations and plunders committed by Greek civilians and Greek soldiers during and after the Greek landing of May 1915. And this is proved even by Greek sources because the Western consuls were so infuriated by the crimes against the Turks of Izmir that they forced the Greek command to punish perpetrators. Yet, among the perpetrators punished for crimes committed on May 1915, on 15th of May 1919, there were 13 Armenians. Moreover, volunteers units were created, Armenian volunteers units were created by 1920. They were often used very cynically by the Greek command to put all the blames on them. Of course, these units committed crimes, but the majority of the perpetrators were Greeks, were not Armenians, in western part of Anatolia in 1920-1921, but they were cynically used. In spite of this cynical use, the number of volunteers Armenian volunteers increased in 1922, under the leadership of General Torka, who was a former military attaché in an Armenian embassy. But my main point is not here. My main point is coming. As it is well known, the Greek forces, including the Armenian Volunteers Unit, burned the Turkish cities of Western Anatolia after the debacle of August 1922. In 2 weeks, barely 2 weeks, the cities of Eskişehir, Manisa, Aydın, etc., were destroyed, mostly by fire, as well as countless villages of the same region and also of the province of Bursa. Many Turks were killed, raped, and so on, including children. But what is much less known is that the Greek forces, including one more time the Armenian Volunteers units, forced the Christian population, both Greeks and Armenians, to leave Western Anatolia, with the same aim, to leave to the Turks a desert. Indeed, Greeks and Armenians were overrepresented among the traders and artisans. And the proof that these Christians were forced to live by the Greek army and not by the Turkish army comes from their own testimonies. Because the unanimous testimonies of the Greek and Armenian refugees cared by the US Navy it was the Greek army that forced us to leave. Similarly, the report of the head of the French Catholic mission in Eskişehir is quite clear. The destruction of the city and the immigration of the Christians was due to the Greek army and nobody else. At least 85,000 Armenians arrived in Greece from Western Anatolia because of this scorched earth policy. In Eastern Thrace, the destruction was less systematic, but the forced immigration of the Christians by the Greek army was as systematic as in Eastern Anatolia, and these people arrived in Bulgaria or others. So I reach my conclusion. The immigration and death of literally hundreds of thousands of Armenians had nothing to do with the CUP or the Kemalist policies. It is not the whole truth, but this is a part of the truth not sufficiently known. And moreover, in spite of the mutual massacres, Ismet İnönü, the main delegate of Turkey at the Lausanne Conference, proposed several times a return of the Armenian refugees, which was refused by the Armenian nationalists. And in spite of all that, Armenian communities survive in cities such as Adana, or Tokat, or Diyarbakir until 1970s, or even until the beginning of 1980s. So that's why the argument no Armenian in Anatolia today is a completely invalid argument. I have finished. It was the end.
Mahsun Bey'e çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Süreyi de...
We would like to thank Mr. Maxim for his also economic use of time and very nice presentation.
Önce birkaç soru var.
There are a few questions,
Sınırlı.
but we have very limited time actually. With your permission, I'd like to answer those questions. First question. Anti-Armenian laws in the Ottoman Empire, hate speech, and rhetoric about the Jews, anti-Jew rhetoric. So are there similar rhetoric used by the young Turks? I should say that throughout the Ottoman Empire, there was no hate speech targeting the nations within the empire because the Ottoman Empire was made up of multiple nations and languages and religions coexisting peacefully. This was the goal of the Ottoman Empire, and it was a goal that was achieved in the territory, which extended vastly. And speaking about the young Turks, they had external collaborators, and in the first election, they had joint lists with which they won in the elections, and this is how they declared the constitutional monarchy. And in the Balkans, you would remember, many people were killed, and there are 600,000 Muslim Turks who took refuge in the safe territories, and looking at the archives, they were registered actually in Istanbul, and they came to Istanbul, and when they came there, they had so much suffering, poverty. They lived in the public baths, inns, mosques, and even in that period, when all of this suffering was experienced, no one came up and said the Turks went and attacked the Bulgarians, the Greeks in Beyoğlu, in Pera districts of Istanbul. So no incident of that kind happened. So this shows the approach of the Ottoman Empire and the nature of the nationalism of the Ottoman Empire. So the enemy for actually us is the Bulgarian in Bulgaria and other nations in other countries, not the nations within the territory of the Ottoman Empire. This is the approach that the people here have. It is an interesting claim that 1.5 million Armenians died. Who first raised this claim and when? And rather than in 1915, they say 1915 to 1923 and speak about a continuous genocide. What is the basis of this allegation? So I should tell you that Armenians are scattered in different regions of the world after French withdrew from Çukurova, Adana. There were Armenians there, and they are also in the Russian territory, so they are scattered all around a vast geography, which has resulted in an identity crisis for them. And also they are building an identity on anti-Turkish sentiments. And in the 5th anniversary of the relocation in 1965, they organized very large commemoration events, programs, and it was like designing a new history beyond the factual history, the facts of history, and they started building an Armenian identity based on these wrong facts in the diaspora particularly. And in the second, third generations, these actually anti-Turkish sentiments and hostility towards Turkish people is a lot more pronounced. And the Asala terrorist organization, for example, emerged in such a framework. And the allegation that 1.5 million Armenians were killed came up in 1965, starting from 1965 in the West and in the Soviet Republic. And this claim of continuous genocide from 1915 to 1923, and this habit of blaming the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish state both in the same way, is another problem. I should tell you that the Armenian population within the Ottoman Empire was around 1.3 million. It was not higher than 1,350,000 in terms of population, but they exaggerate these numbers and they tell it was a lot more. And now, before closing the session, let me give one more answer. As you know, on April 24th, there was a communique that was issued by the Ottoman state, and it is the date when the Armenian committees gathered together. And the Ottoman Empire made a list, made an inventory of these, and it was around 610. 356 of them were Dashnaks, and 173 of them were Hunchaks. And on the night of April 25th, 235 detentions, arrests were made. And there were lists including their names and addresses. So 235 arrests were made in Kayseri, Aydın, Elazığ, Diyarbakır, in different parts of Anatolia. The number of committee members was 321. So the Those who were arrested in Istanbul, 155 of them were emigrated to Çankırı, and 35 of them were released after 15 days, but there are 71 of them who were convicted in the Ayaş military penalty institution prison, and these were the Dashnaks committee members, and they were held there, convicted there in the prison until the end of World War I. So it's not like they all disappeared suddenly. The Ottoman tried to keep them alive as far as it could, and some of them died in the hospital, and it is even in the records kept by the Ottoman Empire. And about the occupation of Anatolia after the armistice of Mudros also, there were some releases. So why do the Armenians put such emphasis on April 24th? Our participant is asking. It is because, my dear colleagues, on April 24, the leading team of Armenians were arrested. And this team, the ringleaders, we can say, was the team that maintained contacts with the international collaborators outside Anatolia. And this is what they cannot absorb, and this is why they put such emphasis on April 24. And April 24 is also important from Turkish history as well. It is the date when the Çanakkale Grand Battle started. So it is also important for our history. And in this panel, we had very distinguished speakers whom I would like to thank once again, because we're already running out of our time. We have completed, I think, right on time. And for this very beneficial conference, I would like to thank once again the Republic of Turkey Presidency's Directorate of Communications, and I would like to thank the participants for their patience. Thank you. We would like to thank the distinguished speakers and the moderator, chairperson of the session, for their valuable contributions. The first session is over. We have a short break now, and then we will continue with the second session, the events of 1915 in the lights of international law. The next session will start at 2 p.m. Thank you.